Hi, this is Mark Bernard with the Bernard Institute for Cybersecurity Excellence, and I'm here to talk about the NIST Cybersecurity Framework program. And the course that we're looking at is Identify, and that's the first module of the NIST Cybersecurity program. And we're also looking at lesson number 5 within that module, which addresses risk management strategy. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that in this lesson. The security reference model is something that I use to help define the architecture of the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. This is quite helpful because it simplifies a rather large document into just a couple pages. And it's easy to find the different, processes within each of the modules. You can see risk management strategy is here. During this lesson, we're going to take you from basically knowing nothing about the NIST cybersecurity framework and about the risk management strategy. And we're going to elevate your understanding so that you understand and comprehend the subject, and also that you'll be able to apply it hopefully in your job. If you're implementing the NIST cybersecurity framework, or you have some plans on it in the near future, this will be a good opportunity for you to better understand the goals for risk management strategy. Of course, after you use this knowledge for a period of time, you will gain additional skills and abilities to troubleshoot, audit, and synthesize or architect new instances of the risk management strategy within other areas of your organization. The goals for the risk management strategy are: number 1, risk management processes are established, managed, and agreed to by the organizational stakeholders. Number 2, organizational risk tolerance is determined and clearly expressed. Number 3, the organization's determination of risk tolerance is informed by its role within the critical infrastructure or the sector-specific risk analysis. Now, I've created some questions to help draw out the knowledge on this particular subject. The first question is: has the risk management strategy process been agreed to by your organizational stakeholders? So perhaps you already have a risk management methodology or a strategy that's in place, and you want to leverage that for the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. But if you haven't, then we're going to show you some information, some ways, some tactics, some strategies on how to get that done and how to do it properly. Number 2, what is the organization's risk tolerance? So this is a threshold. Sometimes it's referred to as a risk appetite. It's how much risk will the organization take on before it decides it's had enough and it's going to take some action and treat the risk. Number 3, does the organization's risk tolerance reflect its role within the critical infrastructure? So that's a big question. Don't know what industry your business, your organization, your enterprise is operating within. Maybe it's a supplier, maybe it's a government ministry. Not sure. Is it important to the economy of your country? If it is, then it's probably an important part of the critical infrastructure. Where does it fit within the process? Is it a manufacturer? Is it a supplier? There's lots of questions that you can ask around doing that assessment. But the risk tolerance needs to reflect where it is, so that the decisions that are made around risk, on what risk to accept and what risk to actually treat, are done so that it continues to drive the NIST cybersecurity program in the right direction. One way to do this is to do a workflow, if you like. So up here we have the Information Cybersecurity Governance Committee, who makes all the decisions about what risks we're going to treat. So the Information Cybersecurity Manager does the risk assessments, manages the day-to-day sort of activities of the risk management program. But when they do the risk assessment, they create a report and they make some recommendations, working collaboratively with the managers who are responsible for those controls or those assets. They make these recommendations to the governance committee in hopes that they will agree to have them treated right away. But it all starts with the risk assessment. And then what is the risk rating? So we calculated the risk in the previous lesson. We talked about how we calculate the risk rating. We want to take a quantitative approach, not a qualitative approach. We also want to look at the risk management strategy or policy. This is important because the policy is one of the key documents that I have found in implementing enterprise security or cybersecurity programs. The policy needs to be agreed to, as well as the methodology, up front in the process. Almost immediately after you establish the governance committee, one of the first jobs that they will have to do is to review the risk appetite and the methodology that we're going to evaluate risk, because it's so important. It's the backbone of many information security and cybersecurity programs, and the NIST program is no exception. If you look at the NIST program, you'll see that the tiers clearly talk about risk management integration within the processes of the organization, also with the supply chain, and also drawing and sharing intelligence with external resources about the risks within the organization. So the risk management policy needs to be drafted, and it's probably one of the first documents you're going to present to the governance committee. The risk management policy will have the risk appetite defined in it, and that appetite I'm recommending as part of my process, my methodology, is that it's a score of 80 or above, so equal to or greater than 80 risk rating. And then the governance committee will make decisions about accepting, rejecting, or transferring risk. Whereas any of the risk ratings that fall below equal to or less than 79 go into a continual improvement process. They may also be added to service desk tickets and initialized that way and assigned to the management groups that are responsible for treating those risks. But it becomes part of continual improvement. Once the governance committee decides on what they want to do, accept, reject, or transfer the risk assessment plan is created, and then corrective or preventative actions are taken in order to resolve the risk. The continual improvement roadmap is where we like to park the risk ratings that are equal to or less than 79 risk rating. And then again, we take preventative or corrective action plans. We may also wait to accumulate them to a certain point and then initiate a new project, a continual improvement project to improve the cybersecurity program. Now, this is a rather detailed architectural perspective. So the people that are more analytical in the room will appreciate this. This is a layout of all the different data sets. This is a normalized relational database. If you're a software engineer, you recognize that name, or if you're a database administrator, you recognize that name. Many popular systems are actually based on normalized relational database, such as SAP. We have several databases, so let me go through this and explain a little bit. Okay, so first of all, we have the legal registry. Now, the legal registry is composed of four classes, if you like, of legal obligations. So there's the regulatory obligations, the statutes. So an example of regulatory obligations may be a PCI DSS standard if you're handling point-of-sale systems. A statute or a regulation could be the Incorporation Act, okay, or maybe it's an Information Protection Act, or maybe it's a GDPR or a FOIPA type act. Internal facing contracts. These are contracts where we have licensed products on site. So we may use Oracle or Microsoft. Those are some of the popular ones, or Cisco. As part of using their products, we sign an agreement, and the agreement says that we will protect their intellectual property. So wherever we put their equipment, we have to make sure that it doesn't get misused or copied, if you like. So these are internal facing. And then there's the external facing contracts. And these are the contracts that we have with customers or suppliers. And if we're part of the supply chain, we may have agreements with manufacturers of components or parts or materials downstream. And upstream, we may have agreements with government entities where we provide a finished product or a service to them. So this is important. It's important to understand the legal registry and to list the legal obligations in the legal registry so that we can apply them within the cybersecurity program. And we'll talk about that more as we go through the lessons on how that gets handled. Next, we have a document registry. And the document registry could be, if you're in government, this could be an ARCs and ORCs type of registry, but it's a registry where we record policies, procedures, practices, standards, Any type of records or evidence might get recorded in here. These are controlled documents. Sometimes we refer to them, so they have a purpose, a function. They need to be protected. They need to be reviewed on an annual basis for updates, and then they need to be refreshed and signed off again. So the document registry is really important. Because if you think of it from a knowledge management perspective, okay, so everyone is born with something we call tacit knowledge, and it's often referred to as the things that we know we don't know, or we don't know that we know. That's it. And then there's another type of knowledge called implicit knowledge, and this is the type of knowledge that when we're doing a process such as configuring a firewall or evaluating the contents of a document to apply a classification and some controls around it, we need to think about that. So we apply our knowledge in the process, and that's called implicit knowledge. However, we take that implicit knowledge and we actually write it down into a procedure somewhere or practice, then it becomes explicit knowledge. So it's documented. And this is where knowledge management links into the document registry. So for any critical processes that we have within the organization, what we want to do is we definitely want to make sure that there are documented procedures, standards, and policies around those. That's 2. 3 is a conformity matrix. And this is something that I've integrated into this process. It comes from the quality management world, and it's a very important document. This document takes a list of all the controls that we agreed to. So within the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, for instance, we have 108 control points. And we map those to the actual policy, procedure, or standard that we're following in order to comply with that. So that information is documented in the Conformity Matrix. Conformity Matrix is a living document that keeps getting updated. It's very useful because we use it internally to keep track of how we're complying with everything. So we have a real-time registry. If somebody asks, are you compliant with this? How do you do that? We can provide it right away. It's already updated. It's right there. It's available. If we have external auditors coming in to audit our processes or our systems, and they want to know how do you do this or do that, well, you know what? We have a complete list of 108 controls, and we have documented exactly how we do all of this, and also where you can find the evidence that we've done this. So, and that's where the records come into play. The Conformity Matrix, very useful. We talked about the asset inventory many times already. It was very important because it's the #1 lesson in the NIST cybersecurity program. So important to understand what your assets are because they have vulnerabilities, and those vulnerabilities could be exploited by threat agents. And we want to make sure that we have a list of the assets so we can treat the vulnerabilities and close down what we call the known threats. So there are some unknown threats, again, that we will talk about later on. But for the most part, 60% of the vulnerabilities or exposures that we have are known, and we can treat those with an effective, efficient cybersecurity program. So that's the asset inventory. The vulnerability database, we go through the evaluation process. We talked about threat modeling. Vulnerability modeling is the same idea. We know what the general top 8 vulnerabilities are, as well as the top 8 threats. So we create an inventory of those, and we review them on a regular basis to make sure that we know what those vulnerabilities are. These are very broad vulnerabilities. So for instance, patching is a vulnerability. All systems need to be patched, so we should have a policy around that and a procedure, and it should be assigned to somebody. We do threat intelligence. So we do threat intelligence by doing honeypot projects or conducting some analysis of threats in order to determine who are the threats. So we may gather that information from an external party. We talked about some of the top ones, CERT and the FBI as well. And we use that to do our threat modeling. Then we do our threat risk assessment, which is to determine what threats our assets are exposed to. This becomes a report with recommendations that gets presented to the governance committee. We can also do business impact assessments. This is a more traditional way to determine what are the impacts of the loss of confidentiality, availability, or integrity to our systems. And once we do the threat assessment or the business impact assessment, we may take an action plan. If it's agreed to treat the risk by the governance committee, we create an action plan. It goes into the corrective action plans for risk ratings 80 equal to 80 or greater. and the SLAs are 2 to 4 hours to resolve those. Or we go into a preventative action plan, and those go into the continual improvement database. And then, of course, there's a risk treatment plan. And this is sort of the dashboard that the governance committee keeps an eye on, that the leader of the cybersecurity program or information security program continuously updates. As they do risk assessments, they update the risk treatment plan. It's basically a dashboard, and it shows all the top risks that are being treated, who's assigned to it, what the delivery dates are, so that if there's any sort of issues or problems with resourcing or capital, the governance committee can take action on those. And of course, the statement of applicability is highly recommended. Not all organizations do this, but it's good for this reason, because when we go through the trouble of doing risk assessments, identifying the vulnerabilities and the threats that assets are exposed to, one of the important things is that we list the controls that we're following. So we keep a registry of controls. That's the statement of applicability. The applicable controls that our organization has agreed to follow. And the reason why we have to go through this formal process to make sure that the governance committee signs off and agrees to the controls, and that we constantly review and evaluate these controls, is to prevent the addition of controls that may create layers of control and might reduce the efficiency of how we conduct a certain process within the organization. So while our focus is cybersecurity or information security, usually our organization's focus is something different. They have a mission. They're producing parts or materials for other organizations, maybe services they're providing, and that is the reason why we're in business, right? That's the reason why we do what we do. Cybersecurity and information security are stakeholders in that process, and in order to be responsible stakeholders, we need to make sure that we do things in a very professional, responsible way. One of those things is to follow the statement of applicability, the controls that we've all agreed to. The governance committee has representatives from all the different portfolios, if you like, within your organization. So they've all agreed to it. So everybody knows that it's formal and it's been agreed to. And this way, if somebody comes in, for instance, an external auditor, and reviews, does a sample and does a review and says, oh, you have all these different gaps over here in this area of the business, we can go back to our statement of applicability to see if we have those controls already approved. If they're not approved, then the first question should be, what's the risk? So it's easy to come in as an advisory, external advisory group and make comments or suggestions, but oftentimes they forget to do a risk assessment. So we need to do a risk assessment to determine what the level of risk or exposure is, and also to evaluate if there's any existing controls. As I mentioned previously in the previous lesson, part of the risk assessment process is to evaluate the existing controls to determine if we already have something to cover it. This way, our promise to business and to the operations area that makes the organization run is that we will continue to monitor the controls that we've agreed to and continue to scrutinize the addition of any new controls to see if we're not already addressing the risks associated with that. So it's a very important block, number 14. Then we do internal audits. Now, internal audits are quality audits because we're reviewing the processes. So remember, I was talking about tacit, implicit, and explicit. So the explicit knowledge that we document, we put in the document registry, that we use awareness training to train up all the people who are handling information or handling sensitive systems. We want to make sure that they're following those step-by-step procedures. So the internal auditor's role is to look at the process, to make sure it's being followed, to make sure there's evidence to substantiate that process is being followed. And if it's true, then we're good. If it's not, then we need to take an opportunity for improvement, perhaps. Maybe it's worse than that. Maybe the process is not being followed at all and we have a big risk gap. So we need to address that. That's what the internal auditor does. Internal auditor is a good friend of our program because they provide the quality management aspect and review. We also might do privacy impact assessments. Compliance with regulations, or should I say statutes such as GDPR or FOIPA. This is in the Enterprise Risk Management Framework, which we'll talk about. is a compliance risk. So this is to make sure the PIA is a compliance exercise. It's a little bit different than risk assessment. Risk, we're looking at assets, vulnerabilities, and identifying any threats that could exploit them. In the privacy impact assessment, we're looking at the legislation or the law, and we're seeing how we're complying with it. We're matching it up. Now, an important part of the privacy impact assessment, of course, is to do a risk assessment. So that's part of one of the steps, because you can't have privacy compliance unless you have information security or cybersecurity. So they do go hand in hand. They are very closely related, but there are two different organizational risks. One is compliance risk. The other is operational or hazard risk. Security health checks. These are something that a really mature organization might do. So they may have managers sit down with their teams once a year and review the controls that were within their scope and affecting the assets under their care. And they may ask questions like, are we following these? And this is really a team exercise. So it's like a 360 review, if you like, of the cybersecurity controls that are within the organization. And the manager will take a close look. He'll do a roundtable with the team and make sure that everyone's following the controls. So this is a good way for a manager to stay on top of things so that the auditor doesn't find deficiencies, or external auditors don't find deficiencies, or we don't have security gaps and maybe potentially a breach or something happening because people aren't following the process, right? So this is good. So the next question, has the risk management strategy process been agreed to by organizational stakeholders? The first step is to create a risk management strategy. So this could be a methodology, in fact. Strategies are usually one-page document or less, but a methodology would include all the different parts. So it would include the risk assessment process, the risk treatment plan, the risk registry, all the different parts of a risk management program. And then they would agree to that. So it would be shared with the stakeholders, they review it, they provide comments, and hopefully we come to some kind of consensus on that. The risk management strategy paper needs to include policy. Should the policy should include a policy methodology and outlines a strategy, procedure, risk treatment plans, as I just mentioned. The risk management policy defines the risk appetite. We've talked about that. Suggests that the risk rating 80 is the first step. Risk management procedure needs to define step-by-step analysis of risks leading to a calculation of the risk rating based on a 100% scale. Risk treatment plan tracks decisions by ownership with target dates. And then there's corrective and preventative action plans. So all of these are part of the strategy or the methodology. What is the organization's risk tolerance? Good question. The risk management strategy tolerance referred to in the NIST, this is more commonly known as the risk appetite. So in the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, they call it a tolerance level, but in most other risk management circles, we call it an appetite. Cybersecurity risk management needs to integrate with overarching enterprise risk management strategy, so the NIST. So this is a big challenge for a lot of information security professionals and as well as cybersecurity professionals. Mapping what it is that we do on the operations side, how it impacts the organization overall. And then after you start to begin to integrating this process within the NIST, and you get some wins and some successes, it'll mature and it'll grow. So in the enterprise risk management framework, for instance, there's 5 big risks. So there's financial risk, strategic risk, hazard risk, compliance risk, and operational risk. So obviously, cybersecurity and information security affect operations. They may also affect compliance. So I mentioned the legal registry and the legal obligations. We define what it is that we need to do to maintain confidentiality or privacy of information. We define what it is that we do to maintain the integrity of our information, our data. This is really important, especially if we have to report externally, especially if we're talking about internal controls for financial reporting. We need to show that we know what the processes are that are involved around the handling of that information and maintain the integrity, and the internal auditor is a key part of that process. The hazard risk involves the safety of employees. So it is possible that some of our cybersecurity equipment and our tactics and strategies are geared toward protecting employees, especially if there's senior management. We may have security details that walk around with our CEO, depending on what company we work in, or our president, or maybe there's some key people on the board or on the executive team that need to be tracked and monitored. So we may have physical security details. We use closed circuit television to monitor our facilities to make sure that employees are safe, as well as to make sure the right people are coming into our building and not the wrong people, and there are no issues. We use access control systems to make sure that only authorized people get access to the authorized areas that their security clearance permits. So we do a lot of things that could impact the hazard to employees around cybersecurity. So that's a good one. Financial risk. We can, from a cybersecurity perspective, help the organization to not have any unplanned expenses. So for instance, Equifax had a breach because they didn't patch a vulnerability, and an external threat agent exploited that vulnerability. And so far to date, it's cost Equifax $750 million to repair that. A lot of organizations that we know, especially the mom and pops, would be completely wiped out if they had a breach of that magnitude within their organization. Their business would be gone, right? But Equifax, because they make several billion a year, they could afford to pay for that, but they had to dip into their treasury. So again, from the enterprise risk management perspective, we can help guard or provide more proactive. So most insurance is reactive after the fact, but proactive insurance is investing in your cybersecurity program or your information security program to prevent it from happening. And that's often a better approach because, as you know from Equifax and many other breaches, usually the first person to get fired by the board of directors is the CEO because there's been a breach. So the CEO is always the most important person in the organization. They're supposed to know exactly what's going on, and when there's a breach, the government and the legal system often see the CEO as the problem, and the board of directors as well. So now from a strategic risk, of course, all of the below that we just talked about, any of those things can impact the mission or the strategic plan that an organization has. For instance, if they're planning on doing mergers and acquisitions and building up their footprint and absorbing their market share over a period of 3 to 5 years, but they have a major breach, all of a sudden that strategic mission may be impaired. So again, the things that we do on the cybersecurity front can help provide preventative measures to reduce the risk within the organization, so our mission is more likely to be successful. The following risk management policy establishes an 80% risk appetite. That needs to be approved right away. Again, I mentioned before, it's like one of the first 1 or 2 documents that the governance committee has to review and approve. Qualitative versus quantitative risk assessments. Some people have been doing qualitative risk assessments for a long time. It's based on opinion. It's hard to it's not evidence-based. It's hard to defend if somebody questions it, especially if it's shareholders or stakeholders. How do you explain that you've had a breach when you don't have any real details around it or around the risk or how you treated that risk? So it can become a problem. What we suggest is a 5-stage system. We talked about this before. Extreme, critical, high, medium, and low. Extreme is a risk rating of 90 plus. Critical is between 80 and 89. High is 60 to 79. Medium is 30 to 59, and low is 0 to 29. There's SLAs attached to this, as well as service desk priorities. SLA for extreme is 2 hours. For critical, it's 4 hours. SLA for high is 10 days. SLA for medium is 30 days, and SLA for low is 90 days. And if you integrate this with your service desk ticketing system and line them up, it works really nice. You can say extreme are like priority ones. They have to be solved in 2 hours. Critical need to be solved in 4 hours. They're priority 2. And high is a priority 3, medium is a priority 4, and low is a priority 5. And this is where you establish your risk appetite. So extreme and critical get treated right away, where high, medium, and low get put into a list of things to do with a date on them. Okay, what is the organization risk tolerance? The risk rating is calculated by analyzing 6 unique assets used to deliver services or products. These assets are people, information, software, hardware, telecommunications, and facilities. We talked about these many times. This is some people might call it a fishbone. We talked earlier about the Vikings using the chevrons and arrows to define their path forward. And this is kind of the approach that I like to think of risk management, is it's our path forward. We have a will, we have a way, and we're going to make our own reality with our own risk management methodology come true. Here what you see is you see the assets, again, people, information, facilities. These are more physical. And then you see the technology assets, telecom, hardware, and software. And within these grids, you can see a list of controls. These controls are from the ISO 27001, in case you're curious. And you can see the distribution of control after we've done our risk assessment. So facilities, not so much. People, not so much. And telecom, a little bit more. But certainly the majority of the control is around information, where it should be, and hardware and software, which has access and stores the information. So this is a good way to map out your controls, to show where you're managing the most risk. Also, if you use it in reverse, if you have a problem and you have a breach or you have some kind of security event or incident that happens, you can go back and pinpoint where that control has been applied and just double check to make sure that it's working properly. People, information, facilities, software, hardware, and telecom. Those are your assets. Does the organization's risk tolerance reflect its role in the critical infrastructure? Well, that's a good question. There are 16 industries listed in the critical infrastructure. These industries are critical to protecting and maintaining our economy. Your organization needs to review these industries to determine where you fit in. So this is a good exercise for you to do. The first 8 are defense-based sector, emergency services, healthcare and public health, energy sector. So the energy sector is kind of odd. It's broken up into a couple different critical line items here. Pardon me. Water and wastewater systems, very important. Food and agriculture, another important one. Critical manufacturing. So this is like technology, communication sector, very important. Telecom. Dams. So this is where I was talking about where the energy is broken up into a couple areas. So you have dams here. You have government facilities, so all the government offices, federal, regional, municipal. Financial services sector. Nuclear reactors. So again, this is very closely linked to the energy sector here. And 4, and also dams. But it's treated separately because of the type of energy and the volatility and the danger that it poses to human health. So there's a number of reasons why it's isolated. Has its own line item, number 12. Information Technology Center, critical sector is important to us. Transportation sector, chemical sector, and commercial facility sector. So those are the top 16. Well, they're the only 16. Somewhere you fit into those, one of those. You'll have to ask probably around. Maybe you already know. Maybe you have a good idea. But this is important with the NIST Cybersecurity Framework because there will be questions around the risk tolerance and around how you're treating risk because it has to reflect on where you sit inside of one of these different industries. The organization's risk tolerance reflects its role in critical infrastructure. So the risk universe, we talked about enterprise risk management before. It defines risks within your organization that depend on external service providers. So here are the big five. These are from the COSO Treadway Commission. These are the enterprise risk management framework. So we have financial risk, hazard risk, strategic risk, compliance risk, and operational risk. We have all the assets here. We have people, information, software, hardware, telecom, and facilities. And then we have service providers. Some of the service providers are within our scope. Some of them are outside. There are many different types of subcontractors and contractors involved here, providing services to different areas of the risk groups within our organization. So we are going to have to evaluate the supply chain, and they will be on the supply chain list to be evaluated. Financial risk, hazard risk, strategic risk, compliance risk, and operational risk all make up the enterprise risk management framework. And somehow our risk management strategy has to support that framework and the products or services that we provide. Again, people, information, software, hardware, telecom, and facilities are the 6 big assets that every service or product needs in order to be successful. Does the organization's risk tolerance reflect its role in critical infrastructure? Continued. The supply chain flowchart can be used to help further analyze the dependencies from suppliers and supply chains. There's raw materials process. There's manufacturing of the raw materials. There's the warehousing of the finished products. And then there's the salespeople who make sure the distribution logistics happen as well as the payment. And here's the distribution part. So finally getting the products after they've been purchased, delivered. And there may be several different groups who are providing us with the raw materials. And those raw materials may be used at multiple different manufacturing locations around the globe or within the country. And they may be stored at one warehouse or many warehouses. And there may be many sales teams working on the sale of our products or services. And they could be distributed through different transportation methods or distribution methods. So you have to, when you do a risk assessment of supply chain, you have to look at all the different angles, right? So, but where do you fit in here? So in order to understand where you fit, are you a manufacturer, raw materials? Do you warehouse stuff? Are you sales or distribution? You have to find out where in order to understand where the risks are that are in front of you. So if you're a manufacturer, then you depend on raw materials to build your products. And you depend on warehouses that may or may not be owned by you in order to store your products before they're sold. So we have a practice. Every one of our lessons will have a practice because our training can be done online, self-paced, or it can be done as a seminar or workshop. So we include practices to help people transfer some of that knowledge, the psychomotor, physical skills that you get from actually doing something, taking the knowledge of the risk management strategy and applying it within your organization. Create a first draft of the risk management strategy. And so once you create the strategy or the methodology, you can share that and circulate that. Identify the stakeholders and socialize your strategy to get support for it. Document the risk management strategy workflow. So you want to know what goes on within your strategy, who's responsible for what. Create a risk management policy that supports your strategy and include a risk appetite. So define it. So we defined 80 in ours. Document your organization's supply chain dependencies and document your organization's critical infrastructure position. So who are your suppliers and who do you provide your services or products to? Prepare a 5 to 7 slide presentation proposing your risk management strategy to the board or to the government's committee to get their approval. Okay, it's question time. So now we want to test how much you've learned on this lesson. So let's go through a few questions, shall we? What are the risk management strategy artifacts? So do you remember what are all the different components that you need to complete or fill out in order to have a good, solid, well-documented, professional risk management strategy? Well, you need a risk management, a risk treatment plan. You need to have corrective and preventative action plans. Strategic business plans are not part of the risk management process. They might be, you might have strategic business plan for cybersecurity or for information security, but usually strategic business plans come from the executive, the CEO, and the executive committee, and they're reviewed with the board, and the board helps to steer that process. It's not part of the board report. A risk management policy is needed. A risk management procedure is needed. You may have job descriptions, or you may not. The ISMS policy is not part of this process. What is the organization's risk tolerance? When a breach occurs, a calculated point or predetermined action occurs. Okay, so that's good. So we calculate the risk rating. Is it a point that cyber insurance kicks in? Not necessarily, no. But if you have a risk registry, it might be one of the risk treatment options. An event where a known risk gets exploited? No, that's exploitation of a risk. That's probably a breach. When exposure is not acceptable. So that's a good point. So risk treatment, when you're treating a risk or managing a risk, at what point is it not acceptable? So you have to make a decision around that. A point that cyber incident management kicks in. Is that the risk tolerance? Is the risk tolerance when an incident gets reported? Not necessarily. When an action is necessary to resolve an exposure or risk? Yes. 3. What are 3 factors that impact the organization's risk tolerance? The role it plays in the critical infrastructure. Within the role it plays within the critical infrastructure. What are the 3 factors? Exposure to risks? No. Labor force skills? No. External suppliers? Yes. Capability? No. Its role in the critical infrastructure? Yes. So that's 2. Physical location? No. Supply chain? Yes. And then executive team? No. All right. Progress chart. Well, let's see, how far along are we getting now? We have 23 lessons in total. You have completed 4, and this makes 5. So you're getting closer to finishing the first course on Identify. So that's fantastic. So this concludes our lesson. I'd like to thank you all for joining me here on this lesson. I look forward to working with you on the rest of the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. And if you have any questions, please let us know. Thank you.